Hello, welcome to the OKPreps Extra show. I'm Patrick Prince, joined by Barry Lewis, here for our weekly discussion on high school football. And all is right with the world, Barry. Playoffs are here, so let's get right into it. Is this the most wide open that 6A1 has been in recent years?
It is probably more wide open than it has been in recent years, but I I think when you look at the past years, in hindsight, it may seem like it wasn't very wide open, but I think going into most of the playoffs over the recent years, it was more wide open than you may think it was. I mean, there's this because Bixby's won 9 state titles in the past 10 years. I think there have been such a juggernaut. Um, the first 7 of those were in 6A too. But you think, well, Bixby, it was a foregone conclusion that Bixby was going to win last year and in 2022. And I think they were definitely a very strong favorite to win last year, no doubt about it. But in 2022, I think it was pretty fairly wide open. I really thought that Union had a great shot at winning the championship that year. And then they got shocked in that 6 overtime thriller in the semifinals. So I think um, but to answer your original question, I think there are so many teams that you could envision winning it this year. I think you would probably have to say perhaps this really is the most wide open it's been. Not to say that the others were a slam dunk previously, except maybe last year, but I think it is more wide open, especially since Norman, and we'll talk about them later, since Norman made this statement win last week, and Edmond Memorial did too.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's take your top four 6A1 teams and just kind of break down the playoff outlook for each one. Let's start with top ranked Owasso. The Rams are undefeated in Antonio Graham's first year. They've been the best team all year. They've looked great. Let's do like a case for Owasso and a case against Owasso. Go ahead.
All right, for Owasso, the case for, they're definitely, I would rank them as the favorite just because they are the undefeated team. They've got the largest body of really good work, 10-0, and for the most part, just totally dominated each team they played. Well, except for those 2 Western teams. And that may say something about the West, as we'll talk about. But yes, it's been amazing how Wasso's never had a letdown. So the case for them is just their consistency every week. For the most part, they haven't shown any weaknesses offensively, defensively, or special teams, just solid in every way. The case against would be, and again, it's really hard to maintain that, bring your A game every week in a long season. The only case that you could put against them is those 2 games against Edmond Santa Fe and Norman North that raised some red flags, but because Edmond Santa Fe is not even in the playoffs. They won 1 game. I mean, granted, as we've talked about, they're better than what their record indicated, but still to almost win at Owasso, that was pretty stunning. They lost by 4 points. And then when Owasso gave up 600 yards in that wild one against Norman North, that also raised some red flags. But those are the only red flags I could see on Owasso. So just such a really solid 10 games that they put in overall.
Let's talk about number 2, Jinx. Their offense was kind of shaky early. They seem to have hit their stride mid-season to now. They're 7-3 going into the playoffs. Talk about the Trojans.
The case for is that just everything seems to be gelling for them. It took them a while to have all those players who moved in, very talented players, for them to all come together, and they battled some injuries, but it seems like they are really peaking at the right time offensively, defensively. The defense has been pretty awesome
Yeah.
in the past month, pretty dominating. And now their 31-12 win over Norman looks even more impressive. So Jenks, as often Jenks does, I mean, so many times it seems like people ask, what's wrong with Jenks? Because they may stumble early in the season, but in 5 of the previous 6 years, they found a way to get to the state championship game under Keith Riggs. And so that's a part of the 4 case. They know what it takes to get to the state championship game. As far as the case against them, it would be that many of the other contenders that, yeah, granted it was early in the season, that they did not fare well against. They did not fare well against Owasso, did not fare well against Union. All that was a fairly even game. And then they lost to Bixby in a really physical grind them out matchup. So they've lost against most of the top contenders. So that would be the case against Jenks.
Number 3, Norman. Welcome to the playoff picture, West Side. They enter the game 9-1. Their only loss was to Jinx, as you mentioned. They were very impressive in a win over Bixby last week. The case for and against Norman.
They've just got such a dynamic passing combination of Phoenix and Ryder Murphy, and they physically are really can be really a challenge for opposing teams. Bill Haston was at the Norman Bixby game last week, and he just said that Norman, it was a lot like when Owasso played Bixby earlier in the season. Owasso just physically dominated them pretty well in every way. And so that's quite a statement to go in there and do that at Bixby. Although I did say going into last week that that's had the same type of vibe going into that game that the Jenks game did. That when Jenks upset Bixby, they end their long 58 game winning streak 2 years ago. Because it was that weird deal where Bixby can lose the game but win the district. Although all depending on the points. That's what last week came down to. So, but still, to do that, considering Norman lost by 39 points at Bixby last year in the playoffs, to turn that, it's a 50-point turnaround. So that's the case for Norman. The case against them is they haven't done it in the postseason before. I think there's a lot to be said for that tradition of winning. Norman hasn't done anything in the postseason basically since they won the championship in 1992. So having been there, I think can mean a lot to programs, but I think Norman showed it's got a chance. It's got, again, incredibly impressive what they did against Bixby last week.
Number 4 in your rankings, the aforementioned Bixby Spartans, defending champs. They're 8-2. The case for and against Bixby.
The case for Bixby is that they've done it 9 out of the last 10 years. They won the state championship. And again, it's sort of alarming what happened to them against Norman last week. But again, it's very reminiscent of what happened 2 years ago against Jenks, and that didn't keep Bixby from winning the state championship. So maybe it's a big wake-up call for Bixby like it was 2 years ago. Their offense isn't quite as explosive as it has been in recent years. That would be a case against, but I mean, if you throw out the first game and the last game, the eight other games are really impressive. Although again, the bar is so high at Bixby when just because their offense isn't as good as it was last year, they're still cranking out over 50 points a game.
Right.
And the case against Bixby is that I just wonder at some point if them not really having a really good running game, that really big time running back to rely on, that if that doesn't catch up to them, especially if the passing game isn't going well, like what happened last week.
Yeah.
And then we've got a couple of others might want to think about, Patrick.
Well, hold on. Before we get to that, I want to ask you this. So Bixby and Norman are on the same side of the bracket, and Owasso Jinx are on the same side of the bracket. Who's going to be in the state final? We'll save the state championship pick for the next show or whatever, but just who's going to be in the 6A1 final?
I would say Owasso and I'll say Owasso Bixby.
Okay. All right.
But again, anything, as we said, this is really wide open. And Edmond Memorial and Union, I think this is a real, ask whether it's more wide open than it ever is before, I don't think I've ever could say that there's 6 teams with legitimate chances of entering the playoffs and getting to a state championship game. And I think there are 6 teams. Edmond Memorial came over. This was a stunner to me. No way would I have thought going into last week that Western teams would come to the Tulsa area and come away with victories at both Union and Bixby. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Of course, it's unbelievable that OU and OSU haven't beaten a major college team in 2 months. So that's unbelievable. It's unbelievable the Dallas Cowboys are in the tank. All in the same year. So, but getting back to the high schools, that game that Union lost last week, that's a game that Union never loses going into the playoffs. I mean, with all due respect to Edmond Memorial, it does speak well to Edmond Memorial. They've got a quarterback who's very much under the radar, David McComb, going to Kansas. And he gives them a chance. That's the thing that about Edmond Memorial and Union. They both got major college quarterbacks. Union was Shaker Rysick. And so you can't discount those teams totally. You've got to give those teams a chance. I think they've got a legitimate chance to make some noise in the postseason. I'm not saying they are. If Union gets past Mustang this week, then they've got the rematch with Jenks. And when Union and Jenks play, anything can happen.
Now Jenks has a first round bye. Yes.
Yes.
Where would that Jenks Union game be?
That's at Jenks.
That's at Jenks. Okay.
Every team that has a bye this week hosts in the quarterfinal.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Okay. Well, you want to drop down to another class here?
All right, let's do it.
All right. 6A2, Muskogee, the probably heavy favorite. They've been number one all year. Do they close it out and repeat as 6A2 champions, which would cap an amazing career for Jamarian Ficklin, or do you see maybe somebody crashing the party here?
I would say Muskogee is a solid favorite to do so. However, can't totally count out Choctaw or Stillwater either. I think, though, compared to a lot of other classes, this is not quite as wide open. I think that it's really among those 3. Maybe Sand Springs can make a run. Sand Springs had a fairly solid effort against Muskogee a few weeks ago, but it really looks like it's Muskogee's year.
In 5A, your top game this week, Barry, number 10, Collinsville at Booker T. Booker T's on a run. They've won 8 straight. Do they make it 9 straight in advance, or do you see Collinsville getting the upset here?
It's a tougher game, first round game, than most district champions have. Say that about Booker T. It's a really tough draw for Booker T being a district champion. And to put in context, about 90% of all district champions in this format win their first round game. When I say this format, the current format that's now not employed in 6A, but employed in 5A and all the other classes, where you've got a 1 seed versus a 4 seed. 90% of the time, the number 1 seed wins. This could be an exception. I think Booker T's defense in the end will be too much for Collinsville, so I'm going to go with Booker T, but Collinsville has a history of playoff success. They're 7-3 record. I mean, as Bill Parcells and other coaches have said, your record, it says what you are. It is what it is. But 2 of Collinsville's losses have been by 1 point. So they very easily could be a 9-1 team. They've got a really good quarterback, really good running back. They know how to win. So it's going to be very much a challenge for Booker T, who relies on its defense for the most part. Their offense is okay, but their defensive line especially, is what really carries the team. So it will be a very interesting matchup, and one that I will be at on Friday night.
I was going to ask you that. So that's the game you're going to be staffing. You'll be at Booker T on Friday night?
Yes, it was a tough decision between that and Mustang and Union. But Bill Hayes and I battled for it, and Bill will be going to Union.
All right, let's talk a little bit about 4A. You got top ranked Wagner. They've pretty much steamrolled their entire schedule this year. They weren't too crisp in a week 10 win last week, but we're in the playoffs now. How do you see their game with Poto going?
And that says something about the bar being high for Wagner when you say they weren't very crisp, and Dale Condit, their coach, admitted that way too many penalties. But still, they wound up winning 40-13. Solid win. And maybe that wasn't a bad thing because his coach Condit said that his players know what it takes to get to the top of the mountain. And maybe last week was a bit of a wake-up call. It gave them some things to definitely work on this week. On the same hand, Poto is not the easiest team to prepare for because of its wing T offense. And you definitely want to get ahead of them. You can't really afford to get behind them at least by a couple touchdowns because they can chew up the clock. Poto has been a tough matchup for Wagner often through the years. They've met often in the playoffs. This is their 5th time in 9 seasons of meeting in the playoffs. Poto beat Wagner 7-3 back in the 2019 semifinals when Poto won the state title. That still is one of the more incredible state title runs Poto had in 19. They scored a combined 16 points in their last 2 games, and that was good enough to win the championship. 7-3, 9-7. But that is the type of team Poto is. So you definitely don't want to fall behind the Pirates. 2 years ago, they met in the semifinals. Wagner grinded out a 30-0 win. And people forget, like in 2017, Wagner's last game on that historic 48-game win streak, which was a state record at the time, they had to rally and win in overtime against Poto in the first round.
Yep.
So Poto, it won't be a cakewalk again. This is one of these number 1 versus 4 matchups that may be tough. I mean, not your typical 1 versus 4 matchup, although Wagner has done so many times when you think they should be playing a tough team, and then they'll put up a 53-0 score like they did against Grove. So when they really get it going, they can also blow a team out. Again, if they jump on Poto 2 or 3 scores, then it could be jump on them really quickly. I think that's the key. Then it could be one of those type of blowout games. But if Poto can hang in there, they can be a tough team. And Wagner, you would think, would be the favorite in 4A, and I still think they are. The Alex Shield night injury does hurt them. And they've got, as Coach Condit said, this is probably their toughest path they've ever had entering the playoffs to get to the state championship, because every game is a toughie. I mean, you got a challenging first round game against Poto just because it's Poto. And then in the second round game, you'd have a rematch potentially of last year's state championship game against Blanchard. Then you've got number 2 Elgin waiting for you, or number 3 Tuttle. So you're having to play all the tough teams if everything goes as expected.
Yeah, that's a good point. Who should be on upset watch this week, Barry?
We mentioned a couple of those teams that should be on upset watch. That our number 1 and 2 games of the week: Collinsville Booker T and Mustang Union. Thing would be concerned about from a Union standpoint is there going to be any letdown after losing last week? Because that was, I think, pretty shocking to them, because they just don't lose on senior night in a situation like that. They've had some regular season losses, but in the past, but usually not in week 10, not at home, not when there's something to play for. So that may be a shock to them. And so how can they rebound from that and not also look past this game for a potential Jenks matchup? So that's the concern. They are playing a Mustang team, which has lost 3 in a row. So they're not playing their best football this season yet at this point. But still, they've got to play to their potential. Anyway, those are the 2 games that there's some put on upset alert. Plus, in 3A, Cassia Hall looks really, really good, ranked number 4. They're hosting Shakota, and they've got the best player Cash has faced all year long. Elijah Thomas, OU commit receiver. So they are potentially dangerous against Cassia. I think Cassia will take care of business, but still, the Commandos can't afford to let down either after a big win last week to win the district at Berry Hill.
Yeah. So you mentioned Bill Hastings is going to be at Union. You're going to be at Booker T. What else we got planned Friday night for coverage?
On Friday night for coverage, we will have Holland Hall at Berry Hill. We've got Sapulpa hosting its first playoff game in 19 years. We'll be there for that one. It's a lot of Eisenhower. We'll be visiting the Chieftains. And we've got several other games also on the schedule that we're still sorting out right now. So we'll have all the playoff action covered for you. We'll have Bethel at Metro Christian. That's another game that is also scheduled. So yes, we will have the playoffs covered, all the playoff coverage that you want.
All right, that'll do it for this week. Thank you for tuning in. For Barry Lewis, I'm Patrick Prince. We'll be back next week and we'll talk a little more high school football. See you then.